Hey there, and welcome to Family Revenge. We're so glad you're here. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can stay with us for every twist and turn. Let's jump right in. I walked into the community center, David's hand in mine, feeling that old mix of pride and unease. It had been years since I'd been back in my hometown, and while the town's familiar faces and small town buzz should have felt comforting, it didn't. It never did. David squeezed my hand, looking around the room, spotting a few of his former colleagues. He was used to crowds like this, the local law enforcement crowd, but I'd never quite fit in. Being a social worker was different. The work wasn't glamorous, it wasn't respected. And then there was my father. I spotted him across the room, leaning over a table with a few of his old buddies. My dad was a cop, a high-ranking one, and I had spent most of my life trying to prove that I wasn't just the daughter of the cop, that I was my own person. Lena, over here, he called out, his voice loud enough for people to hear. I turned toward him with a half smile, already bracing myself. Just a caseworker, he said, louder than he needed to. Must be nice to have a job that's really making a difference. I froze. That familiar sting shot through my chest. The words weren't new. They'd been drilled into me for years. But it didn't make it any easier hearing him say it like that, like I was some kind of failure. David's grip on my hand tightened. Don't let him get to you, he murmured. But I knew he saw the damage too. I didn't want to make a scene. So I just smiled and nodded, the way I always did. But it was hard to ignore the way everyone's eyes shifted toward me, and the way my father's voice echoed through the room. David didn't let it slide, though. He took a step forward, his voice steady but loud. Your daughter's a hell of a lot more than just a caseworker, he said, addressing my father directly. She's saving lives in a way you never will. For a second, everything went still. I could see the shock in my father's face. He didn't know how to respond, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it if he did. David stood his ground, his gaze steady. And if you can't see that, then maybe you don't need to be here. The room was quiet, and I felt the heat of 100 eyes on us. My dad opened his mouth, but then closed it again, swallowing whatever was on the tip of his tongue. Without another word, he turned and walked away. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. The humiliation was familiar, it always had been, but this time, it felt different. It felt more real somehow, more final, like something had shifted between us. David turned to me, offering a quiet, supportive smile. I didn't smile back. I wasn't sure what I felt, just heavy. The sting from my father's words lingered even as the event wore on, though I did my best to ignore it. I tried to focus on the conversations around me, the small talk with people who didn't know better than to ask how I was handling things at work, but my mind kept drifting back to him, to the way he'd always looked at me like I didn't quite fit. Not because I wasn't smart or capable, but because my choices were never the ones he would have made. I remembered when I was a teenager, how clear the divide was between what I wanted and what my father wanted for me. His expectations were never subtle. He never cared about what I loved or what I cared about. What mattered was what he thought was worthwhile. And to him, that meant following in his footsteps. Jake was his golden boy, the one who had joined the force, who wore the uniform with pride, the one who carried on the family tradition. And me? Well, I was the one who spent her weekends at the local shelters, talking to kids who had nothing, trying to give them something to hold on to. I'd been volunteering at the homeless shelter since I was 14, trying to make sense of the world, trying to put something good into it. But none of that mattered to my father. He'd tell me I was too soft to make it in a real job, like the people I was helping were any less real. You're not cut out for this, Lena, he'd say, his tone sharp and dismissive. Social work is for people who don't understand the real world. You'll never get anywhere. I had heard it so many times, I stopped counting. But it was his disapproval that always hurt the most. I could never measure up to what he wanted from me. So I kept doing what I did, kept chasing what I believed was the right thing, even if it meant he'd never understand. He never saw it as anything but a hobby, a nice little thing to keep me busy while the real work happened on the force. But I knew deep down that this was what I needed to do. This was where I could make the most difference. I want to help people, I had told him once in one of our few serious conversations. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, my mom's absence like a shadow between us. She'd passed when I was too young to remember her voice, but I remembered how she'd always encouraged me. She never told me to follow my father's path. She'd say, "Find your own way. You don't have to be like anyone else." But my father was different. To him, there was one way, and it was his way. "What are you going to do, Lena?" Help people talk about their problems? That's not a job. You're not cut out for it, he said, his eyes narrow and critical. I sat there, quiet, trying to hold back the frustration. Why couldn't he see it? Why couldn't he see me? Instead of backing down, I kept pushing forward. I threw myself into my studies, into my volunteer work, into every moment where I could prove I wasn't just soft. But my dad made sure I knew every chance I got that I would never be good enough. The year I graduated from high school, I finally told him I was applying for a social work program. His reaction was predictably cold. "A waste of time," he muttered. "Get a real job." It stung. But there was a fire inside me now, one I hadn't felt before. His rejection only fueled my drive. My mom would have supported me. She would have been proud. I knew that much. But she was gone, and all I had left was my father's dismissiveness and my own determination. It was enough to get me into a program, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension between us. I knew my path was different, but it was mine. And I wasn't going to apologize for it. I got the letter in the mail a few weeks after I submitted my application to the social work program. I was sitting on the couch, the weight of my dad's last comment still fresh in my mind, when I ripped open the envelope. My heart raced as I read the first few lines. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to our master's program in social work." For a second, I just stared at it, trying to wrap my mind around it. I did it. I made it. All the long hours of studying, all the sleepless nights, all the fighting to keep my dreams alive despite my father's constant pushback. It had all led to this moment. But as much as I felt the surge of pride, I knew exactly how my father would react. I wasn't expecting congratulations or anything close to it. He had always seen social work as a soft job, and I was about to prove him right in his eyes. When I told him, it went exactly like I thought it would. "Social work?" he laughed, a full, dismissive chuckle that rang through the kitchen like a slap. "That's a hobby, Lena, not a career." I felt the bitterness rise in my throat, but I kept my mouth shut. I'd learned over the years that arguing was pointless. The man who raised me had never taken my ambitions seriously. Why would he start now? I tried to hide the disappointment in my voice when I said, "It's a real job, Dad. I'm going to help people." His smile dropped. "Help people? You mean play therapist to a bunch of strangers who don't know how to pull their lives together? You'll be out of work in a year. Mark my words." It was like I wasn't even talking to him. Like the years I spent volunteering, studying, proving myself never counted for anything. I wasn't like Jake, who had followed his footsteps into the police department. I wasn't the kind of success my father valued. I never would be. The thing that hurt the most, though, was the lack of recognition. No acknowledgement that I'd just been accepted into one of the top programs in the country. No pride, no sense of understanding. Just an offhand dismissal. I didn't let that stop me. I couldn't. I pushed through the next few years of my life, throwing myself into the program and blocking out the nagging voice in my head, the one that kept reminding me that my father's words were still there, still cutting at me. I buried myself in my studies. I made friends with people who understood, who saw the value in what I was doing. And I kept my mother's memory close. She had always supported me, even if my dad couldn't. Whenever I felt like giving up, I'd remember her voice, soft but steady, telling me, "You can do this, Lena. Keep going." Graduation day came, and I stood there, diploma in hand, with no family member in the audience to cheer me on. My dad never showed up, not that I expected him to. Jake, of course, had a job he couldn't miss. But even without them there, I still felt a sense of accomplishment. I had done it on my own. I didn't need my father's approval to feel proud of what I had accomplished. The program had pushed me, challenged me, and ultimately shaped me into someone I could respect. And that was enough. But still, there was a quiet, nagging ache in the back of my mind. My dad's voice, as sharp as ever, lingered in my thoughts. "Don't embarrass the family with these soft jobs." I didn't give up. I wouldn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that, for all I'd achieved, I was still fighting for something I might never get: his approval. I'd been working as a social worker in the heart of a tough neighborhood for a little over a year now, and if I was honest, the work was harder than I'd ever imagined. It wasn't just the violence or the endless red tape. It was the daily grind of trying to make a difference in a world that didn't care. But despite all that, I knew I was good at it. I'd figured out how to navigate the chaos, how to get through to people who had been written off by society. There was one case, though, that would stick with me for a long time. Marcus, a 16-year-old kid who'd been caught in a mess of bad decisions. He was facing a prison sentence for something that didn't quite add up, a crime that didn't fit the circumstances. The legal system had already turned its back on him. His lawyer didn't care, and no one was willing to speak up for him. But I wasn't about to let him go down like that. I knew he wasn't a lost cause. He was angry, yeah, but that anger was a defense mechanism. It was the only way he knew to survive in a world that constantly told him he was worth nothing. I spent weeks working with him, digging into his background, talking to his teachers, his old counselors, anyone who might see the kid I saw. And when the court hearing came, I made my stand. I walked in there with everything I had, a file full of documentation, a defense that was rooted not in excuses, but in facts. I argued his case like it was my own. I wasn't going to let him be just another number in the system. When the judge finally ruled, it wasn't a win, exactly. Marcus was still facing some serious consequences, but he didn't go to prison. He was sent to a program that actually stood a chance of helping him turn his life around. It was the best outcome we could have hoped for, and I knew I'd made a real impact. Word spread about what I'd done, and soon enough, I was getting noticed. My superiors, the ones who had doubted me when I started giving me more cases, more responsibility. They could see it too, my ability to make a difference. But as usual, my father didn't. A week after I was featured in an article about my work with Marcus, I got a voicemail from him. It was brief, just like him. "Don't let all this publicity get to your head," he said, his voice cold, like he was lecturing me instead of congratulating me. "This isn't a big deal. Don't start thinking you're anything special." I held the phone in my hand for a moment, the words ringing in my ears. This isn't a big deal. I hadn't asked for the publicity. I didn't care about it. What mattered to me was the work, the people I was helping. But no matter how many lives I changed, no matter how much progress I made, it would never be enough for him. I threw the phone on the couch, the voicemail still hanging in the air. I didn't listen to it again. It didn't matter. I had a job to do, and that was where I had to focus. So I kept pushing forward, kept doing what I had always done, helping those who needed it the most, even if it didn't come with any recognition from the people who should have been proud of me. The lack of validation from my father, from my family, wasn't something I could shake off, though. It sat heavy on my shoulders, a constant weight that I couldn't quite shrug off. It was hard not to feel like I was always running, always trying to prove something to someone who would never understand. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. David and I had always talked about having a small wedding. Nothing extravagant, just the people who truly mattered to us. We focused on our friends, our colleagues, the people who had been there for us in all the ways that counted. My team, the ones I worked alongside every day, had become my family in ways my blood family never did. They were the ones who saw me, who understood me, and who celebrated the person I was. But then there was my dad. I wrestled with the idea of inviting him. Part of me wanted to, hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the time he'd come through. That he'd show up, maybe make a half-hearted attempt to acknowledge me, not as the daughter of the cop, but as Lena, the person I'd become, the professional I was. But the other part of me, the smarter part, the one that had learned the hard way over the years, knew the risk. He'd probably show up with a smirk, or not show up at all. He'd probably make some comment about how soft everything was, how my job was just a hobby, and how he had more important things to do. I could already hear his voice in my head. David noticed me going back and forth on it. He was patient, but I could tell the thought of my father's possible absence was starting to weigh on me. One night, as we sat at the kitchen table, I finally brought it up. "I don't know if I should invite him," I said, twisting the invitation in my hands. "I can't keep putting myself out there only for him to reject me." David looked up from his laptop, his eyes soft but firm. "Lena, this day is about us, not about him. Don't let him spoil what you've worked so hard for. This is your moment, not his." I nodded, but his words didn't settle right away. He was right, of course. It wasn't supposed to be about my father. It was about the two of us, about building a life together. Still, there was this nagging need for something more, for an acknowledgement, even if it was just a quiet nod. So I sent the invitation. I wrote the damn thing with all the hope I could muster, hoping for a response, even if it was just an empty, half-hearted gesture. And I didn't expect much. But when the envelope came back, I still wasn't ready for it. There, in front of me, was the return address I knew all too well. The invitation inside was checked. Just one guest, no note, no signature. Not even a looking forward to it or congratulations. Nothing. It hit me hard. The words felt colder than I expected. Maybe I should have known better. Maybe I was still that little girl, hoping for a sliver of approval from a man who had never seen me. I sat there with the envelope in my hand, letting the hurt wash over me for a moment. It wasn't surprising, but it was still painful. David was sitting across from me, his brow furrowed when he saw the look on my face. You okay? He asked, his voice low, his eyes searching mine. I took a deep breath and forced a small smile. Yeah, I'm fine. It's just. I paused, not sure how to finish the sentence. I didn't want to say it out loud, but the disappointment was there, sitting like a stone in my chest. David's expression softened. I'm sorry, Lena, but don't let that stop you. We've got what we need, us and the people who've always had your back. I nodded. I had my team. My friends, I had David, who had always respected me, always understood what I needed, and maybe that was enough. I didn't let it derail the wedding plans. We kept moving forward. The hurt didn't stop me, but it would always be there, just beneath the surface. A reminder that no matter what I did, my father's approval wasn't something I could ever count on. The day of our wedding arrived, and it was everything we had planned. Small, quiet, and intimate. Just a handful of people. David's close family and my colleagues, the ones who knew me, the ones who understood. I'd chosen an old friend and fellow social worker, Tasha, to officiate. She was the kind of person who'd get it, the kind who didn't just throw words around, but really meant them. We wanted the ceremony to feel grounded in who we were. Nothing flashy, just real. David and I had talked about this day for months, and even with the absence of my father, I felt a strange peace as I stood there, looking at him, knowing he understood me in ways that went beyond the surface. His respect for the work I did was the bedrock of our relationship. He didn't just love me, he saw me, truly saw me, and that was enough. I was standing by the altar when the first unexpected thing happened. I'd been so focused on the ceremony, on the vows we were about to take, that I hadn't even heard the chatter at the back of the room. Then, just as Tasha was about to begin, the door opened with a soft creak. At first, I thought it was just someone running a little late, but then I saw them, my team. They weren't supposed to be here. This wasn't some grand public event, just a small ceremony with a few close people. But there they were, each of them dressed in their formal uniforms, still carrying the weight of the charity event they'd just come from. They were grinning, some of them with tears in their eyes like they couldn't wait to be there, to witness this moment with me. And then, like a gesture I hadn't expected but needed, they stepped forward. The room went quiet as they began to walk toward me, their steps confident and steady. Each of them, a person who had stood beside me through some of the toughest moments of my career. Each of them someone who saw me not as the daughter of a cop or just a caseworker, but as someone who made a difference. They didn't say a word. No need to. Their presence spoke volumes. Tasha stepped aside as they walked down the aisle, and I felt the tears start to well up, stinging my eyes, the lump in my throat making it hard to breathe. This wasn't the ceremony I had imagined in some corner of my mind. It was better. These were the people who truly mattered. These were the people who had always been there, in the trenches with me, and now they were standing in front of me as a silent but powerful declaration of solidarity. When they reached me, each of them gave me a quiet nod, their eyes full of respect. I could feel the warmth and love radiating from them. I had my family, maybe not the one I was born into, but the one I had chosen. The one that understood me, that accepted me. David, who had been standing at my side through it all, reached for my hand. His smile was soft, knowing exactly what this meant to me. You okay? He whispered, his voice just for me. I nodded, the tears finally slipping down my cheeks. Yeah, I whispered back. I'm good. The ceremony went smoothly from there. Tasha spoke words that held weight, words that acknowledged the journey we'd taken together, not just as a couple, but as two people who had walked through life with purpose and understanding. The vows we exchanged were simple but real. No fluff, no pretense. Just a promise to stand by each other, always. As the ceremony ended and we were pronounced husband and wife, I looked around the room at the people who'd come to witness it, and my heart swelled. My father's absence was undeniable, but it didn't sting like I thought it would. It wasn't unexpected. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. And in that moment, I knew that the family I had built, this chosen family, was the one that truly mattered. The ones who stood by me, the ones who respected my work, my values. The ones who had seen me for who I was, not just what I did or where I came from. David's quiet understanding was the cornerstone of everything. And as we walked out of the ceremony together, hand in hand, I realized that with him, I had everything I needed. The reception was going smoothly, the buzz of conversation and laughter filling the air. David and I danced, drank, and mingled with the people who had shown up to support us. My colleagues, the ones who had stood by me through thick and thin, were chatting excitedly, laughing at inside jokes, making memories. It felt like home, even more than my actual home had ever felt. I'd almost forgotten about my father until I spotted him near the bar, standing with a group of his old friends. He was leaning back, looking every bit the part of the man who thought he was above all this. His eyes flickered around the room, scanning the guests, and for a second I wondered how he'd managed to get in. Then it hit me. He had come uninvited. No surprise there. He probably didn't even consider how his presence would land. I didn't want to make a scene. I tried to ignore him, lost myself in the warmth of the people around me, and for a moment I almost convinced myself he was just another distant figure. But then I heard his voice, sharp and loud, cutting through the hum of the room. "Just a caseworker," he sneered, his voice carrying enough for a dozen people to hear. He was still standing by the bar, surrounded by his old cop buddies and a few of my family friends. His tone was mocking, dismissive. My daughter, just a caseworker, handling the hard cases. Yeah, she's really changing the world. I froze. The room went quiet. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said it. Like my entire life's work was a joke, a hobby, as he'd put it all those years ago. His voice rang in my ears, thick with condescension. I could feel the burn of embarrassment creep up my neck, my face heating with the sting of humiliation. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to let him see the effect his words had on me. Not now. Not in front of everyone. I stood still, my body tense, letting the silence of the room stretch out between us. David must have seen it, must have felt the shift in the atmosphere. He was right there beside me, but now he stepped forward, moving toward my father and his group. His face was calm, but there was no mistaking the intensity in his eyes. "That caseworker," David said, his voice firm and controlled, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "is my wife, and she's the reason people's lives are changing." I watched as my father's expression faltered, his smirk tightening. The room, still silent, held its breath. David didn't back down, didn't let the tension linger. His words hit harder than I could have imagined. For a moment, my father was caught off guard. He choked on the sip of his drink, his face momentarily rattled. The man who always had an answer, always had something sharp to say, was silent. And that silence? It was golden. The guests, the ones who had quietly observed the exchange, seemed to sense the shift too. There was no applause, no overt acknowledgement, but the room seemed to hold a quiet respect for what David had said. They saw it too. They saw the woman I had become, and they recognized my worth. Not because of what I did for a living, but because of who I was. My father, still processing the words, didn't say anything else. He just stood there, his grip tightening on his drink as he avoided eye contact with anyone. A few people glanced at each other, clearly uncomfortable, but no one challenged David. David didn't look back at me, not right away. But when he did, his eyes softened. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, just for me. I nodded, the tension in my chest starting to loosen. "Yeah," I whispered, though the ache of his words still lingered. David's hand found mine again, grounding me in that moment. The room began to fill with life once more, the hum of conversation returning. I could feel my heart still pounding, but it wasn't from anger or shame. It was something else, something like clarity. My father's absence, his rejection, didn't define me. What had just happened didn't define me. The people who were standing beside me, the people who knew my worth without needing to be told, it was them who mattered. And David, my husband, my partner, the person who had always seen me, was the one who truly understood what it meant to be seen. The silence that followed David's words hung in the air for a moment longer than I expected. My father didn't say a word after that. He didn't even look at anyone. Without so much as a grunt, he turned and stormed out of the room. The guests barely moved, too stunned by the confrontation to react. I didn't follow him. I wasn't about to chase after someone who had already made his decision about me. My father had always been a man of his word, and if that word was to walk out, then let him walk. I was done trying to earn his approval. Instead, I stood there in the middle of the room, my heart still racing, but something in me felt lighter. Maybe it was the sense that, for once, I didn't need to prove anything to him. The tension in the air began to dissolve, and the quiet, respectful murmurs of the crowd filled the void left by my father's departure. It wasn't immediate, but one by one, my colleagues and friends started to rise from their seats. Slowly at first, but then with more certainty. They didn't clap or cheer, they didn't need to. This wasn't about some grand performance. This was a quiet recognition of what I had done, of who I was, and of the work I had put in to earn their respect. No one spoke, but I could feel it. The subtle shift, the silent acknowledgement that I had finally become the person I had always hoped to be. Not for my father, not for anyone who didn't understand, but for the people who mattered. For the people who had seen me work day in and day out, who had stood with me when the world felt like it was pushing me down. They were standing with me now, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. David's hand found mine again, and he didn't need to say anything. The way he looked at me was enough. He saw me, truly saw me, in a way my father never had. His support had always been there, unwavering, and I felt it now more than ever. I glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the people who were now quietly acknowledging me, not with applause, but with their presence. They didn't need to shout it from the rooftops. They didn't need to make a scene. They just needed to be there, in that moment, sharing it with me. And for the first time in my life, it felt like the world had finally aligned with who I was, who I had always been, beneath all the judgment, all the expectations. I wasn't just my father's daughter, I was me, a woman who had earned her place in the world on her own terms. The room began to hum again, the conversations resumed, and the tension that had weighed us down seemed to lift. My father's absence was no longer the focal point. The people who stayed, who had seen me for who I really was, were the ones who made this moment what it was. And it was enough. The reception continued without a hitch, but I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't about my father anymore, it was about me, about David, and about the life we were building together. There was no more struggle for validation, no more need to prove myself. I stayed in the moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most, feeling a quiet victory that didn't need to be shouted. It was enough to simply be seen. A few days after the wedding, I found the letter in the mailbox, tucked under a stack of bills and junk mail. It had no return address, just my name written in a familiar hand, the letters sharp and angular. My heart did a strange flip in my chest. I hesitated before I opened it, the mix of curiosity and wariness settling in my stomach. Inside was a photo, just one. It was of the wedding day, taken from the back of the room. In the background, my father was standing by the door, watching. His face was mostly obscured, but I knew it was him. There was no note, no message, except for a few short words scrawled on the bottom of the photo. I missed the ceremony. I've been thinking about what you said. I saw the salute. That was it. I stared at the letter for a long time, my fingers tracing the edges of the photo. Part of me wanted to feel something, anger, relief, anything, but all I felt was nothing. It wasn't the answer I'd been waiting for, the apology or acknowledgement I had expected, but it was the one he was capable of giving. For a moment, I sat there in the quiet, letting the weight of it sink in. He had shown up, in his own way. He had been there, watching, even if he couldn't bring himself to actually be present. But more than that, he had noticed. The salute, the respect David had shown me, the fact that people had stood for me, not because of who I was to him, but because of who I had become. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. I didn't need his approval anymore. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn it, chasing something that wasn't meant to be mine. But now I saw it clearly. My worth wasn't tied to his opinion. His absence, his dismissiveness, didn't define me. I was no longer that girl trying to make her father proud, trying to prove I was more than just a caseworker. I had become the person I was always meant to be, without his validation, without his permission. The letter, the photo, it all felt like a strange kind of closure. Not the kind I had imagined for so long, but the kind I needed. A quiet kind of release. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. It wasn't a step forward, but it was the final step in letting go. For the first time in my life, I knew I didn't need to keep trying to earn something from someone who wasn't capable of giving it. I had built something else, a life with David, with my colleagues, with people who respected me, who saw me, and that finally was enough.